So let's now finally get started with writing some code. And for that, I want to write our first view and also add our first URL. Now, first things first, I first of all want to restart my development server here so that we can preview the application. And we do this by running Python 3 manage py run server, which brings up this development server. I will minimize this here a bit. And now on localhost 8000, I can see this dummy starting page. Now the goal here for the moment is to create such a challenges website. And let's say we want to be able to visit /challenges here and then simply append something like January and then see our January challenge. That could be our first goal since we're talking about monthly challenges here. Now, to achieve this, we want to go into the challenges folder, which we created, and there into the views.py file. And in there, we can now create new views, which of course brings up the question what exactly a view is. But I mentioned before that a view is either a function or a class. We're going to see both in the course, but I want to start with a function here. And therefore, in the views.py file, we can define a new Python function. And I will name it index for now, though that name is up to you. And in this function, I then want to return something. Now, what I want to return here should be the response that is being sent back to the client. So to the browser sending that request. And I also actually want to accept an argument here, a parameter. A parameter which will be passed in automatically into this function when it's executed. Because this function will not be executed by us by calling it somewhere else in our code. Instead, we will soon make Django aware of this function, and Django will execute this function for us when an incoming request hits this Django server and is forwarded to this function. Therefore, here we want to accept a request and we want to return a response. Because that's this cycle which we have between our client, the user visiting our site, and our server. We exchange requests and responses. And it's the job of the views to process those requests, to maybe reach out to a database if we want to do that. We don't want to do it here, but we later will, and to then create and return a response. So we're getting the request. Now we want to return a HTTP response. And that actually is an object which I want to instantiate, and therefore I also need to import this object to reference it here. And we can import it from django.http. From there, we can import the HTTP response. Now, that instantiates the object by adding parentheses here. That is regular Python code. And as an argument to this constructor function, which we're calling in the end here, HTTP response basically is a class which we're instantiating. So as an argument to this instructor function, we can pass our response data. So the data we want to send back to the client. That could be a HTML file, though we'll dive into that later. For the moment, I'll send back a string. I will send back a string where I say, this works. And we can fine-tune this later. Now I pressed the auto format shortcut here to restructure this a bit. And with that, we created our first view. It's really not too fancy. It's just a function that takes a request and sends back a response. And of course, we're not doing anything with the request here. Later we will, but we should still accept it. Now, that alone is not enough, though. Just by adding this function, Django has no chance of knowing when it should call this function. Should it call it for every incoming request, or only for incoming requests to /challenges or /challenges/January? When should it call this function? Well, that is something we need to tell Django. And for that, we save this views.py file and add another new file next to views.py inside of the challenges folder. And that's the URLs.py file. Now we actually already have a URLs.py file in that main project subfolder, the monthly challenges subfolder, but we need to add a new URLs.py file next to views.py in the app we're working on. And in that URLs.py file, we should create a new list, a list which we name URL patterns. And in Python, we create lists like this with square brackets. And in that list, we now want to list all the URLs we want to support. So something like challenges January. And then the view function that should be triggered when a request reaches that URL. And we do that by using a function Django exposes to us, the path function. Now we need to import this function. From Django URLs, we import path. That's a function we need here. And the path function then takes two arguments. The first argument is a string which describes the URL we want to support. So that could be challenges/January, but actually here it should be just January. And I'll come back to why it's just January in a second. So here our path is just January. The second argument then is a pointer at the view function that should be executed when a request reaches that URL. And for that, we need to reach out to the views.py file where I have this index function. So we want to import that views file, and we can do that with from dot import views. That is regular Python syntax for telling Python that from the same folder as the URLs.py file is in, so from that challenges folder, we want to import the views.py file. And then we can access views.index here, pointing at that index function defined in the views.py file. And with that, we're basically telling Django, if a request reaches /January, then execute this index view function. Now that's a first step, but it's not everything. This creates a so-called URL config, or often also called URL conf. We configure the URLs we want to support in this application and which views should be triggered for the incoming requests. Now this will not be enough though, because this is now a URL config defined in our challenges app, which is part of the overall monthly challenges project. Therefore, we now need to connect this challenges app to the entire project. We need to make the entire project URL config aware of the URL config for this specific app. And that's where we now dive into the URLs.py file in the monthly challenges folder. So in the main project setup folder, which is part of this project. There you see you already have URL patterns, and you already have a path in there, which you can ignore for now. And that's now where we want to add another path. We want to add another path here, and here I want to point at challenges. Not January, but challenges. And then I want to load all the URLs that are defined for the challenges app for the challenges URL. And we can do this with another function, which we can import from Django URLs, and that's the include function. With that here, we can call include, and to include, we pass a string where we say challenges.urls. So the app name, challenges, and then the file name where the URLs for that app are defined. And since it's URLs.py, it's .urls. You don't add the file extension here. It's really just app name and then file name of the URL config for that app. And here we should also add a trailing slash. Now with that, I'm saying that the overall Django application should handle requests which are sent to challenges, so localhost 8000/challenges, and should basically forward those requests internally on the server, you could say, to the URL config of the challenges app. And there, we then parse the URL after the /challenges part, because we already forwarded only /challenges requests to the challenges URLs, and look at the part after /challenges, like /January thereafter, to then call a view function. Because of all of that, if we save all these files and we go back to our preview server, if we visit localhost 8000/challenges/January, we should see this works. Now, if you don't see that, attached you find a snapshot of my project, which you can use to compare your configuration and code to mine to find that tiny error you might have somewhere. But with that, we now registered our first view and the URL config for it. And the URL config is actually split across two URL-py files, one for the app, the challenges app, and one for the entire project. And the one for the entire project basically just is able to route requests that start with different paths, so these URL segments after the domain, to different apps you might have in your project. Here we only have one app, but we could of course have more apps. And then we say that all requests which start with /challenges after the domain should be forwarded, in quotes, it's not a technical forward, but internally it's forwarded to the challenges app, then check the URL config there, and see what comes after /challenges in this case. So here it's January, and then look for January in the URL config of this app to find out which view function should be called ultimately. And that is a core mechanism of Django, which is why I'm putting so much emphasis on it. That is one of the core fundamentals you have to understand when working with Django. When a client, so you using the browser, sends a request to a server running Python Django, then on that server, Python checks the URL config, or possibly, typically, multiple URL configs, one for the project and one for the app, which it's then forwarded to. Then you might have multiple view functions. We only have one here, but often you will have more than one, and we're going to add more than one soon. And depending on the URL that was entered, one specific view function will be executed, and that view can then do something with the request if it needs to, extract data, for example, but it then generates a response and sends back that response to the client. That's how this works. That's how URLs and views are working together. And now we're going to dive deeper into that and learn more about that.